Hi there, my name is Nate Pike. I was the Alberta Party candidate for Calgary Northeast in the last provincial election. Before any of you jump on your keyboards and start leaving comments, yeah, I know I didn't win. But there's a couple of things that I have to sort of figure out for myself coming out of this election. One of the things that I ran on was the fact that I really wanted to make sure that our communities got a voice that was going to elevate issues for them and that was actually going to try to make sure that our communities do get a bit of a voice. There were over 1,700 people in this election who felt like I should be the guy to do that. And I put myself up to do that, and I have a hard time just walking away from that. So part of this is me trying to figure out how I'm going to do that best. The second piece of it is one of the things that politicians seem to do after they lose an election is get some sort of media platform thing going. 770 hasn't called me yet for some reason, don't know why. So I'm kind of have to do my own thing. So this is going to be probably every 2 or 3 weeks, going to be doing some videos where we talk about some of the bigger issues that are happening inside of the province. And I'm going to try to make some of the political issues that we're seeing go on in the legislature and around the province a little easier to understand, because a lot of stuff that's going on is really confusing and there's a lot of different conflicting pieces of information going on. We've got a tentative working title for this thing. It's going to be called The Breakdown. And this week we're going to try to talk about a bunch of different things. If you take a look around, what you'll see from me right now is I'm actually standing in the middle of the field where our high school is supposed to be built. And a big part of the reason for that is because one of the things that all of the candidates promised is that this high school would get built. Well, it's been roughly a month since the last election, and as you can see, no high school being built yet. So I'm going to keep filming here until we do get our high school built. Now, we've got a bunch of different issues that we want to talk about, but the first one that I want to talk about is Bill 12, or the Turn Off the Taps bill. This was a bill that Jason Kenney got a lot of mileage out of during the election, where he was talking about how when he first came into power, in the very first hour, he would get it proclaimed. Well, when he actually held his first caucus meeting, it took him a little bit more than an hour, but after social media called him out on how long it was taking, he and his caucus eventually did proclaim it. Now, this is where understanding how a bill becomes law is really, really important. So this bill was actually introduced in April of last year, and it was introduced by the NDP in response to the BC Premier's claims that he was going to do everything that he could to try to stop TMX pipeline from being built. Now, what happened there is the NDP crafted some laws that they knew were super high risk, and they knew were very likely to get challenged in court. So they had that bill go all the way through. It got approval in the legislature, but they stopped just short of proclaiming it into law, because they knew as soon as they proclaimed it into law, the government would have to defend a constitutional challenge from BC that would be launched immediately. So if they wanted to get any mileage out of the bill, they had to proclaim it and then pretty much immediately turn off the taps. At the time, Jason Kenney made a big deal issue about how it made no sense whatsoever to produce a bill like this and then not immediately act on it. So to be really clear, the whole reason why the NDP didn't proclaim it into law and immediately use it is because they didn't want to have to use it right away. They wanted to go the road of negotiation first. This was something that Jason Kenney made a heck of a lot of fun of them out of. And when he was campaigning, he made a big point of the fact that as soon as he got elected, he'd proclaim it. On April 30th, after he had his first caucus meeting, he didn't announce that he proclaimed it, and he got a whole bunch of flack on social media. Shortly after, he did announce that he proclaimed it, but he immediately followed it up by stating that he wasn't immediately going to be using the bill. And here's a clip of that.
I underscored for the Premier, it is not our intention to use the powers in this legislation at this point. When you're in a game of poker, you don't show the other folks around the table what your high card is. You don't play that high card on the first hand. And so we're going to play the long game here.
Again, one of the biggest concerns that's been brought forward, and was a big topic of conversation during the election, is whether or not Bill 12, or the Turn Off the Taps bill, was even constitutionally viable. There were constitutional experts, there were constitutional lawyers who were saying all the way through the election campaign that this was not something that was going to be able to withstand a challenge in court. So with all of that information out there, one would think that upon coming into office, Jason Kenney and the UCP would do the due diligence to actually go ahead and get an informed legal opinion before they went ahead and proclaimed this bill into law. But when Jason Kenney was asked about it, here's what he had to say.
Before Cabinet voted yesterday, did you get any type of legal opinion that Bill 12 would actually survive a constitutional challenge?
I have not yet received and read a legal opinion. I have been briefed by officials, and those are the same officials that advised the last government that wrote this legislation. So we're taking the same legal advice that the NDP received.
So Darren Bellis, when we spoke with the media yesterday, said that Ms. Notley, I guess on the way out the door, told you that you shouldn't do this. She didn't have any kind of opinion or any better advice for you?
Well, I'm first of all,
So ultimately, the irony of the whole Bill 12 situation is that it has been proclaimed into law. BC has already lodged a complaint, and they're just working to get an injunction against Bill 12. But ultimately, the taps haven't been turned off, and Jason Kenney has openly come out and said that he's not going to use the Turn Off the Taps bill to do the job that it's been designed to do in the way that was designed to do it. At the end of the day, the whole Bill 12 Turn Off the Taps thing, it's just political theater. The next topic that I want to talk about is the whole question of Doug Schweitzer, his involvement in the UCP leadership race, and particularly his role now. So for those of you that don't know, over the last couple of months, it's been made very clear that there was some fraud of some level used in the UCP leadership race. Now, this is actually a pretty big deal, and it's a whole topic that I want to unpack in another video. But suffice to say, let's just agree going forward from this point that there was issues with voter fraud in the UCP leadership race. Now, whether those issues were big enough that they would have changed the outcome, we're going to find that out in the next couple of months, because one of the things that's going on is the RCMP are currently investigating the UCP leadership race, and they're trying to figure out how extensive the fraud is. When the UCP won the election, one of the first things that Jason Kenney did is he named Doug Schweitzer as, he's the MLA for Calgary Elbow now, that he named Doug Schweitzer as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General for the province. Now, Doug Schweitzer's a lawyer, so he's reasonably qualified for this role, but there's some other stuff going on in the background that's really important to know about to understand just what kind of position our province is in right now. So first of all, Doug Schweitzer was one of the leadership candidates for the UCP leadership when they had their leadership race. So right out of the gates, he's already got some bias going on and towards any investigation that has to do with the leadership race. He's not the best person to be acting as the highest legal authority in our province on that matter. But secondary to that, and even more important than that, Doug Schweitzer was one of two leadership candidates during that leadership race who came forward with concerns that there was fraud going on, not only in regards to how secure PINs were, but in regards to how many people were able to access voting from computers. He believed that there were something called virtual private networks, or VPNs, that were being used to circumvent the rules that were going on around the election. Now, of course, that all got very quickly and quietly settled after the leadership race was done, but we're now seeing with these investigations that some of the concerns that Mr. Schweitzer brought forward were actually quite legitimate, and that's one of the reasons why the RCMP are doing this investigation. So not only does he have a bias because he was one of the leadership candidates, but he also has a huge bias because he's the guy who was trying to blow the whistle in the first place, but now he's been given a role as a minister inside the government. The optics of that, whether or not it has anything to do with making him quiet, the optics of that are absolutely terrible. And there's political pundits and political experts from across the country who are already saying this is a really bad move because it calls into question the integrity of whatever the result of this is. And this is a really important investigation that our province absolutely has to get right. Because if we find out that Jason Kenney did win the leadership legitimately, that's something that people need to be able to get behind. But if we find out that Jason Kenney didn't win the leadership legitimately, then there shouldn't be any question as to whether or not this was something that Doug Schweitzer organized in order to try to get the leadership back himself. So making sure that we do this right is absolutely critical. That's why so many people are calling for Doug Schweitzer to recuse himself from any of these investigations. To give you an idea of how bad this actually is in context with something comparable, when Donald Trump was being investigated by Robert Mueller, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, because of his affiliation with Donald Trump, recused himself from any investigations that were ongoing into Donald Trump. So what Doug Schweitzer has effectively done is he's taken the bar and he's set the bar for investigations in Alberta lower than what actually happened for the Trump investigations. This is your new Minister of Justice and Attorney General, everyone. Last week, thousands of students across the province of Alberta walked out of their classrooms at 9:30 in the morning in order to protest some changes that the UCP have said they're going to make to the protections that are afforded to GSAs or gay-straight alliances. Now, this is a really complex issue. There's a lot of emotion behind it. So in order to kind of unpack it and begin to understand it, there's 4 basic questions that we really need to answer. The first question is, fundamentally, what are GSAs? The second question is, what is Bill 24? The third question that we need to answer is, why do people want these changes made? Why do they want to get rid of Bill 24? And the fourth question is, what is actually going to change? So the first question, let's go to, what are GSAs? Fundamentally, what GSAs are is they're school clubs that are run by students but supervised by somebody provided by the school. And they came about because kids in high school started to realize that LGBTQ youth were at significantly higher risk of having some really terrible things happen to them. So some of the terrible things that can happen to these kids, first of all, LGBTQ youth are 8 times more likely to try to commit suicide than their heterosexual counterparts. 1 in 3 homeless kids identify as LGBTQ, and of those kids, the vast majority of them identify the reason why they're homeless as because they were rejected by their families. This all boils down to the fact that while the vast majority of parents out there are very supportive of their kids and they do provide positive environments for their kids, there are some parents that just don't. And the reality, the hard reality that we gotta own is the fact that there are parents who kick their kids out of their homes because they've decided to come out to them. And for kids who come out when they're in high school or in junior high, that's an incredibly vulnerable time for them, and it ends up leading to all kinds of additional trauma that they experience on the streets. To be clear, GSAs are just clubs. There's no curriculum, there's no sort of agenda that's being advanced. And in fact, from what I've heard anecdotally, the vast majority of conversations that happen at GSAs don't have anything to do specifically with LGBTQ issues. More than anything, they're a safe place where these kids can go to get some support from other kids who want to actually support them. And for a kid who's going through the kind of challenges that we just talked about, that support can be absolutely life-saving. The next question that we need to answer is, what is Bill 24? So Bill 24 was introduced as a bill that was designed to create some framework and some rules for how GSAs are created and how they go about their business. There's a couple of main things that you have to know about Bill 24. First of all, it states that if a kid requests that a GSA gets started at a school and that school doesn't have one, that request has to be approved immediately by the principal. Next thing that it does is it says that when that request comes in, the principal has to find as quickly as possible an adult that can supervise the GSA meetings. It doesn't run them, it's just there as a supervisory capacity, no different than a chaperone at a dance. But there has to be an adult provided that can supervise those GSA meetings. The next thing that it does is it provides some framework in regards to making sure that only the principal of that school can communicate to the parents that a GSA has been started. And that's all that the principal is allowed to communicate. So it makes sure that which kids are going to this GSA isn't reported back to anyone. It gives the kids some privacy if they need it. Now again, I want to be really clear. If a parent has a strong relationship with their kid, I can't see any reason why a kid wouldn't be comfortable telling their parents about that. If the kid isn't comfortable telling their parents about it, there's a reason for that. So that's why this framework exists. The other big thing that Bill 24 did is it made it clear that if there were schools that chose not to follow this regulation, the Minister of Education had the ability to put some penalties in place to make sure that if a school chose, for whatever reason, not to be a part of this process, they would have some penalties to face. This brings us to our next question, which is, why do people have problems with Bill 24, or why do people even have problems with GSAs? And there's really only a couple of answers for that one. The first one, overwhelmingly, is misinformation. There's been a lot of stories that have been reported on or repeated in social media that simply aren't true. One of the big ones that we hear a lot about is the kid who was taken off of school property while he was at a GSA. Well, let's be absolutely clear here. That's not a GSA problem. That's a violation of every school security protocol that I've ever heard about. And I got kids that go to a young school. It would be kidnapping for somebody to take a child off of school grounds without their parents' permission. And that rule extends and covers GSAs. So that story is simply not true. And in fact, the person who was involved in this story came forward to the media about a month ago and said, whoa, 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 that's not what happened. Unfortunately, the version that was initially reported still gets repeated, and it makes people afraid. The second problem that we have is people think that there are non-qualified staff or people who could just wander in off the street who could be leading these GSAs. Again, that's patently not true. Volunteering to lead a GSA is no different than a parent or a guardian or anybody else volunteering to work in a child's classroom. Here in Calgary, if you want to volunteer to work in a kid's classroom, you have to get a security check. There's a bunch of other things that you have to do, and you have to report when you come and go. It's not just some random person showing up and leading the organization. It's simply not true. One of the biggest concerns that people have, though, about GSAs is there's the belief that if a child was to be at risk, if they were in significant distress, that a teacher wouldn't be able to elevate that to the proper authorities and that kid would just somehow fall through the cracks. The reality is that's simply not true. Ask any teacher, they'll tell you if they believe that a kid's at risk, they have a legal responsibility to report that, and Bill 24 doesn't override that. If a kid's suicidal, a teacher has a responsibility to report that. That hasn't changed. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems that we have is that because a lot of these misleading stories have been repeated and repeated and repeated, people, especially people in high places, have a tendency of unfortunately not only believing them, but repeating them. We saw this at the candidates debate that I was involved in over at the Genesis Center when I tried to correct one of the other candidates and explain that their interpretation of how GSAs work simply wasn't correct. If a child's in distress, a teacher can report that. This candidate refused to believe that. And in fact, I'm going to play a clip in just a second here where you'll see that she says, as I'm offering the correct information, I don't believe that, I don't believe that. Here's that clip.
To be absolutely clear, what Rajan just said is not true. If a teacher believes that a child is at risk, they have a responsibility under law to report that. This GSA piece has nothing to do with that. That's false information. You go ask any teacher, they'll tell you different.
I don't think that's true. That's not
Secondly, in regards to the pipeline.
That is not true.
To give you an idea of how serious this can get when this sort of misinformation is repeated and repeated and people start to believe it, that candidate is now the MLA for Calgary Northeast, and she's also the Minister for Community and Social Services. This is the ministry that is in large part going to be responsible for reaching out to LGBTQ kids that are on the street that have had to deal with these problems. When these lies get repeated, they turn into very real problems and they put kids at risk. Now, one of the other pieces of this conversation that gets a little bit awkward, well, a lot awkward actually, is the fact that when we're talking about the difficulties getting GSAs started, we're not so much talking about the public school system, we're talking about private schools. And in particularly, we're talking about faith-based private schools. And in fact, if you take a look at the names that are listed on a current lawsuit trying to get the Bill 24 revoked, most of those schools are faith-based schools. I want to be really clear. I don't have a problem with faith-based education. I never have, I never will. I was raised in a faith-based home, and I absolutely believe that people who live faith-based lives can get a lot of comfort and they can get a lot of direction from their faith. I don't have a problem with people and their faith. But what I do have a problem with is when kids, and we've shown, the science is in, there's an organic component to how people fit on the LGBTQ spectrum. When kids don't have access to supports that acknowledge that, those kids are at risk. And particularly when we're talking about kids in faith-based schools who have parents who aren't accepting of them, those are the kids who are most at risk for homelessness and suicide and depression and all of the other horrible things that Bill 24 is trying to protect against. So the last question that we have to answer is what's going to change when the UCP inevitably roll back Bill 24 and remove a lot of the protections that have been provided to these GSAs? Well, one of the things that the UCP likes to say over and over again is that Alberta will still have the strongest anti-bullying protection in place for kids in schools. That's actually a little bit arguable because if you take a look at what the actual laws will be, BC will edge us out a little bit. We'll be better than the rest of the country, but the reality is that a rollback of rights is still a rollback of rights, and that's what these kids are so upset about. So functionally what we're going to look at is there's not going to be any sort of a time limit that's required for how long it takes for a GSA to be established after a student requests it. That means that if a student requests a GSA, that principal can potentially drag their feet for as long as they want to before they actually set up the GSA. The next thing that's going to happen is that private schools are going to be exempt from all of this legislation. So given that faith-based schools are some of the schools that have some of the biggest challenges with this issue, not having them be involved in a mandatory program to have GSAs exist to get these kids the protections that we know they need is dangerous. And that's really the only word for it. The third thing that comes into place is that there will not be any guidelines in regards to what sort of privacy rules teachers need to follow when they're navigating these kids and their involvement in GSAs. And to give you an idea of how serious that actually is, one of the things that happened that prompted the creation of Bill 24 is the fact that the Alberta Teachers Association, which is the largest association of teachers in our province, said, look, we do not want the power to be able to out LGBTQ kids. We want that taken away. We don't want anything to do with it. One can't help but wonder if Jason Kenney really believes that teachers are the ones to be trusted and it's their discretion that should determine whether or not parents are informed as to their kids' involvement in GSAs. If they've spoken in a unified voice in their association and said, we want nothing to do with this, why won't he listen? So that's pretty much it for our first little episode of the breakdown. We're going to try to get some title credits worked out somewhere down the road. Might even get some theme music. We'll see what happens there. But there's a lot of different topics that I still want to cover. And in particular, if there's any topics that you want to see discussed, I'd love to hear from you. Some of the topics that we're looking at, definitely going to be talking about the carbon tax in the next video because there's been some really interesting developments there. Definitely going to be talking about TMX and the status of it as a pipeline right now. And then one of the big issues that just popped up today, we're going to be talking about the UCP efforts to be able to allow hate speech on post-secondary institutions, which is actually in contravention of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. So that's going to be fun. If you have any questions, love to hear from you. Thanks.